A blind girl asks strangers if she can play her violin for bread on a cold December evening in Manhattan. Her voice barely a whisper above the rush of indifferent crowds, and a weary businessman stops to listen, drawn by a melody that cuts through his grief like light through darkness. Never knowing that the trembling hands clutching that worn instrument belonged to Elena Morrison, the world's most celebrated concert violinist who vanished from the stage 6 months ago after a devastating diagnosis, leaving behind sold-out concert halls where tickets commanded $10,000 and a classical music world desperately searching for answers. And that his simple act of compassion, offering a meal to a stranger who seemed to have nothing, would unravel a mystery that had captivated audiences across the globe and change both their lives forever in ways neither could imagine. Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. The corner of 57th Street and 7th Avenue had never felt so vast, so empty. Despite the hundreds of people rushing past in their heavy coats and determined strides, Elena Morrison stood there, her back pressed against the cold stone of a building that rose into a sky she could no longer see, her fingers wrapped around the neck of a violin that had once commanded the reverence of concert halls across 3 continents. The dark glasses perched on her nose were cheap, purchased from a street vendor for $5. Nothing like the designer frames she once wore to galas and premieres. Her coat, donated from a shelter bin, hung loose on her frame, the fabric thin and offering little protection against the December wind that sliced through the Manhattan streets like a knife through silk. At her feet, her violin case lay open. The red velvet interior faded and worn. A few coins scattered inside that she had placed there herself, a desperate attempt to suggest that others had found her worthy of their generosity. She had been standing there for 20 minutes, and in that time she had not spoken a single word. Her throat felt tight, constricted by fear and shame and the awful weight of what she had become. 6 months ago, she had walked away from everything. From the spotlights and the standing ovations, from the 5-star hotels and the private jets, from a life where her name alone could fill a theater and her playing could command $10,000 a ticket. 6 months ago, the doctors had spoken words that shattered her world more completely than any physical blow ever could. And in her devastation, in her terror, she had simply disappeared, leaving behind a world that knew her only as extraordinary. Now, she was no one, invisible in her ordinariness, and the sounds of the city crashed over her in waves she could not predict or control. Car horns blared, heels clicked on pavement, conversations swirled around her in fragments. Someone laughed, someone shouted. A siren wailed in the distance. Without her sight, every sound felt amplified, chaotic, threatening. She forced herself to speak, her voice emerging as barely more than a whisper. "Excuse me," she said to the rushing footsteps. "Please, may I play for you? Just for bread, or anything you can spare." The footsteps did not slow. She tried again, her voice trembling. "Please, let me play." No one stopped. No one even paused. Her fingers tightened on the violin, and she wondered, not for the first time that day, if she had made the most terrible mistake of her life. She lifted the violin to her shoulder, the familiar weight settling against her collarbone like an old friend returning home after a long absence. Her bow hand trembled as she positioned it over the strings, and for a moment she thought she might not be able to do it. That the fear would win, that she would lower the instrument and walk away and never try again. But then her fingers found their positions, the muscle memory of 30 years overriding her terror. And she began to play. The melody was simple, a folk tune her mother had taught her when she was 5 years old. Long before the prestigious academies and the competition circuits and the recording contracts. But the moment the first note sang out into the cold December air, something shifted inside her. The chaos of the city sounds faded into background noise. The fear loosened its grip on her chest. She was no longer Elena the blind beggar, Elena the lost and desperate. She was simply music. And music was simply her. Her bow moved across the strings with a grace that belied her trembling hands. each note pure and clear and achingly beautiful. A transformation came over her entire body. Her posture straightened, her head lifted. The exhaustion and shame that had weighed her down moments before seemed to evaporate, replaced by something transcendent, something that existed beyond sight or circumstance or the cruel judgments of fate. She played, and for those minutes she was whole again. A few people slowed their pace. One or two stopped, standing at a respectful distance, heads tilted in appreciation. Most simply walked past, some dropping coins into her case without breaking stride, the metallic clink barely audible over her playing. They did not truly listen. They did not truly hear. They saw a street musician, perhaps slightly better than most, and they offered their spare change out of habit or guilt or the vague sense that it was the kind thing to do. Elena played for 2 hours, moving from one piece to another, her fingers growing stiff with cold, her shoulders aching, her legs trembling with the effort of standing still for so long. When she finally stopped to rest, her hands shaking as she lowered the violin, she knelt carefully and felt inside her case. Her fingers found coins, perhaps $7 or $8 total, and something wrapped in paper. A sandwich, half eaten, the bread slightly stale. Someone had left her their leftovers. The humiliation of it burned in her throat, but her stomach cramped with hunger, and she was grateful nonetheless. The temperature was dropping. She could feel it in the air, in the way her breath caught in her lungs. People had told her darkness was falling, that the street lights were coming on. But she could not see them. She could only feel the city changing around her, the energy shifting from day to evening. One more song, she told herself. Just one more, and then she would find her way back to the shelter, if they had room for her tonight. James Chen walked across the marble lobby of the building that bore his company's name in sleek chrome letters. His phone pressed to his ear, his other hand gripping his briefcase with the kind of tension that had become permanent in his shoulders over the past year. His chief financial officer was talking about quarterly earnings, about projected growth in the Asian markets, about the acquisition deal that would expand their reach into artificial intelligence development, and James heard the words without really listening, making appropriate sounds of acknowledgement while his mind drifted somewhere else entirely, somewhere gray and empty and tired. He was 52 years old, and he had everything a man was supposed to want. His company was worth $3 billion. His penthouse apartment occupied the entire 48th floor of a building overlooking Central Park, with floor-to-ceiling windows and custom Italian furniture, and a wine cellar stocked with bottles that cost more than most people earned in a month. He had cars he never drove, artwork he never looked at, a chef-prepared meal service that delivered food he barely tasted. He had success, wealth, power, influence, everything except the only things that had ever actually mattered. His wife Sarah had died a year ago. Cancer that came suddenly and took her even more suddenly. And in the 12 months since, James had learned that a penthouse apartment designed for 2 people felt cavernous and cold when occupied by only one. He came home each night to silence and expensive emptiness, to rooms that echoed with absence, to a bed too large and sheets too cold, and a closet that still held her clothes because he could not bring himself to remove them. His daughter Emma barely spoke to him anymore, their conversations reduced to polite text messages and obligatory holiday phone calls, filled with long pauses and careful subjects that avoided anything real. She blamed him, he knew, for never being there, for choosing board meetings over recitals, business trips over birthdays, the company over the family. She was not wrong. He had built an empire and lost everything that gave it meaning. Lately, he had been contemplating selling the company, retiring at 52, walking away from it all. But to what? To more empty rooms and silent evenings? To days without purpose or structure? Work was all he had left, the only thing that filled the hours and kept him from thinking too much about how thoroughly he had failed at the things that actually mattered. He ended the call with his CFO and pushed through the revolving door into the December cold, his destination the parking garage 3 blocks away. His mind already planning tomorrow's meetings, anything to avoid the present moment and the weight of his own loneliness. He was half a block from the parking garage when the music reached him. A single violin cutting through the urban noise with a clarity that seemed impossible given the chaos of the evening rush. James barely registered it at first, his phone still at his ear. His CFO now discussing the timeline for the Tokyo office expansion. But then the melody shifted into something achingly familiar, and his feet stopped moving as though they had forgotten how. The piece was Massenet's Meditation from Thais, a composition Sarah had loved with the kind of passion most people reserved for living things. She had played the recording constantly during the last months of her life, when the treatments had stopped working and they both knew what was coming. And she would lie in their bed with her eyes closed and tears sliding down her cheeks while the violin sang of beauty and loss and transcendence. James had not heard it since her funeral. The phone slipped slightly in his hand, his CFO's voice becoming distant, meaningless. "I'll call you back," James said, his own voice strange and thick, and he ended the call mid-sentence, something he had never done in 20 years of running his company. He stood there on the sidewalk, his briefcase hanging from his hand, his expensive coat doing nothing to warm the sudden chill that had nothing to do with December weather. People flowed around him like water around a stone, annoyed at the obstacle, but he could not move. The music held him captive. It was not just technically perfect, though it was that every note precise and pure. It was something deeper, something that spoke of understanding, of someone who knew what it meant to lose everything and still find beauty in the wreckage. The violinist was playing with her entire soul, and that soul was laid bare in every phrase, every trembling vibrato, every moment of controlled passion. James felt his throat tighten, felt the burning behind his eyes that he had not allowed himself to feel in months, that he had pushed down and buried beneath work and meetings and the endless machinery of success. The song ended, the final note hanging in the cold air like a question without an answer, and the silence that followed felt impossibly loud. James stood there, this man who commanded boardrooms and controlled billions, brought to complete stillness by a street musician. He looked toward the source of the music and saw her, a slight figure in a threadbare coat, dark glasses, violin lowered but still held carefully, her head turned slightly as though listening. She sensed someone nearby. He realized. She was waiting. The moment stretched between them, fragile and profound. And James found he could not look away. James found his feet moving before his mind had fully decided, crossing the sidewalk toward her, weaving between the rushing pedestrians who paid neither of them any attention. When he reached her, standing close enough to see the worn patches on her coat, the frayed edges of her sleeves, he opened his mouth to speak and found his voice catching in his throat, rough with emotion he had kept locked away for too long. "That was beautiful," he managed finally. "Do you know any other pieces?" Elena turned her head toward his voice, and he saw her shoulders tense slightly, her grip tightening on the violin's neck. She nodded, a small, careful movement. "What would you like to hear?" Her voice was soft, cultured, not what he expected from someone standing on a street corner asking for bread. James hesitated, then said, "Paganini's Caprice 24, if you know it." It was a test, though he had not consciously meant it as one. The piece was notoriously difficult, a showcase of technical virtuosity that separated true masters from merely skilled players. He expected her to decline, to suggest something simpler. Instead, Elena stood very still for a long moment, and he saw something like fear flicker across her face, followed by something harder, more determined. She lifted the violin again, positioned her bow, and began to play. James felt his breath leave his body. The piece was a whirlwind of double stops and left-hand pizzicato, of rapid-fire runs and complex variations that required not just skill, but absolute mastery. She played it flawlessly, her fingers flying across the strings with impossible precision. Her bowing controlled and nuanced, despite the thin bow and worn instrument. This was not the playing of a talented amateur or even a very good street musician. This was the playing of someone who had spent a lifetime dedicated to absolute excellence. Someone who had trained at the highest levels. someone who belonged on the world's greatest stages. When she finished, her hands were trembling, and she lowered the violin quickly, as though afraid of what she had just revealed. James stared at her, his mind racing. "Who are you?" he asked quietly. "Elena," she said. "Just that." No last name offered. "How long have you been playing on the streets?" "Not long." Her voice was barely a whisper now. "I lost." She stopped, her throat working, her hands clutching the violin like a lifeline. "I lost everything." The words hung between them, weighted with a grief James recognized in his own bones, and he understood without being told that she was not speaking merely of possessions or money, but of something far more fundamental, far more devastating. James made a decision that felt both impulsive and somehow inevitable, as though the universe had been pushing him toward this moment all evening, and he was finally surrendering to its current. "Have you eaten today?" he asked, and the question came out more gently than he had spoken to anyone in months. Elena's head dipped slightly, a small shake. "No." The admission seemed to cost her something. James felt a tightness in his chest, a anger at the world that could allow someone with such extraordinary talent to stand hungry on a street corner. "There's a diner 2 blocks from here," he said. "Let me buy you dinner. No strings attached. I promise." "Just a meal." Elena stiffened, her wariness visible in the set of her shoulders, the way she angled her body slightly away from him. She had learned, perhaps, that kindness from strangers often came with prices she could not afford to pay. But she was so hungry. And something in his voice, some quality of genuine sadness that matched her own, made her believe he meant what he said. "Okay," she whispered. "Thank you." She bent carefully and felt for her violin case, closing it with practiced movements, then retrieved a white cane that had been leaning against the building. James noticed how uncertainly she handled it, how her movements suggested someone still learning this new language of navigation. "May I?" he asked, offering his arm. And after a moment's hesitation, she took it, her grip light and tentative. They walked slowly, James adjusting his usual brisk pace to match her careful steps, calling out curbs and obstacles, learning as they went how to move together through a world he could see and she could not. The diner was called Marie's, a neighborhood place with cracked red vinyl booths and linoleum floors, and the kind of unpretentious authenticity that James had not experienced in years. The warmth hit them as they entered, a wall of heat and sound and the smell of coffee brewing and bacon grease and something baking, maybe pie. Elena inhaled deeply, and James saw her shoulders relax slightly, the first easing of tension since he had approached her. A tired waitress with kind eyes showed them to a corner booth, and Elena slid in carefully, her fingers tracing the edge of the table, learning its boundaries. When the menus came, James read the options aloud, but Elena stopped him quickly. "Just soup and bread." "Please," she said. "Whatever kind of soup." She was ordering like someone who knew hunger, who understood the value of warm food in a cold world. James looked at the menu, at the steak dinner he would normally order, and found himself saying, "Make that 2 soups and bread." The waitress nodded and disappeared, and James sat across from a blind street musician in a diner he would never normally enter, and felt more present, more alive, than he had in longer than he could remember. The soup arrived steaming in thick ceramic bowls, tomato basil with a richness that spoke of hours of simmering, and bread still warm from the oven. Elena wrapped her hands around the bowl first, absorbing the heat, and James saw her close her eyes behind the dark glasses, savoring the simple comfort of warmth. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the kind of silence that felt companionable rather than awkward, and then James found himself asking as gently as he could, "How long have you been blind?" Elena set down her spoon carefully. 6 months. There was an illness. Sudden, the doctors said. She stopped, swallowed. "It doesn't matter what they said. I lost my sight. Then I lost my job, my apartment. I have no family, no one to help. So I ended up where you found me." The facts were delivered simply, without self-pity, but James heard the ocean of grief beneath them. He nodded slowly, then realized she could not see the gesture. "I lost my wife a year ago," he said, and the words came easier than he expected. "Cancer. We had been married 26 years. And then she was just gone. I have a daughter, Emma. She's at college, studying music theory. We barely speak. She blames me for never being there when she was growing up, for choosing work over everything else. She's not wrong. He paused, staring at his soup. I built this successful company, made more money than I know what to do with, and now I come home every night to an empty apartment and wonder what any of it was for. The wealth means nothing now, less than nothing. Elena turned her face toward him, and even though he could not see her eyes, he felt the weight of her attention, the quality of her listening. It was not the polite half-attention most people offered. Their minds already formulating their next words. She listened with her entire being, as though his pain mattered to her, as though she understood. Grief is not weakness, she said softly, and her voice carried a conviction that came from hard-won experience. It's the price we pay for love, for caring about something beyond ourselves. You haven't failed because you feel lost. You've failed only if you stop trying to find your way back. The words were simple, almost plain, but they landed in James's chest with the force of revelation. He felt something crack open inside him, some sealed chamber where he had locked away everything he could not bear to examine. "How did you get so wise?" he asked, his voice rough. Elena's mouth curved in a sad smile. "Losing everything teaches you what matters. I'm still learning the lessons." James set down his spoon, his appetite suddenly gone as a thought occurred to him that he should have asked earlier. "Where are you staying tonight?" he asked. Elena went very still, her hands frozen around her soup bowl. The silence stretched long enough that James knew the answer would be bad. "There's a shelter," she said finally. "On 34th Street. Sometimes they have beds available." "Sometimes?" James felt his stomach clench. "What happens when they don't?" Elena's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "The subway stations are warm. I find a corner where the transit police don't bother people. It's not so bad." James felt something like rage surge through him. Not at her, but at a world that could allow this. At himself for walking past countless people in need without truly seeing them. At the cosmic unfairness that could take someone with such talent and leave them sleeping in subway stations. "No," he said, the word coming out harder than he intended. "That's not acceptable. I own a small apartment building in Brooklyn, rent-controlled units, long-term tenants. One apartment just became vacant last week. It's yours, rent-free, until you get back on your feet." Elena's head jerked up, and he saw her mouth open in shock. "What?" "No, I can't. I don't even know you." "Why would you?" Her voice was rising, caught between hope and suspicion, and James could see her withdrawing, her defenses slamming back into place. Why would a stranger do this? "I don't know," James said honestly, and he struggled to find words for something he barely understood himself. "I just know that I've spent the last year feeling completely useless. Like nothing I do matters. Like I've failed at everything that's actually important. And maybe helping you won't fix any of that. But maybe it means something. Maybe it's a start. I have resources I don't use, an empty apartment that's just sitting there. Please, let me do this one decent thing." His voice cracked on the last words, and Elena's face crumpled. Tears began sliding from beneath her dark glasses, tracking down her cheeks, and she reached up with trembling hands to wipe them away. "I don't understand," she whispered. "People don't just help anymore. Not without wanting something." "I don't want anything," James said quietly, "except maybe to feel like less of a failure, to help someone who needs it. That's all. I promise." Elena sat there, tears still falling, her whole body shaking with the weight of emotions too large to contain. Finally, she nodded, a small, jerky movement. "Okay," she breathed. "Okay. I don't know how to thank you." James drove them to Brooklyn in his car, a silence between them that felt full rather than empty. And when they arrived at the apartment building, a modest brick structure on a tree-lined street, he guided Elena up 2 flights of stairs, narrating each step, each turn, until they stood before a door marked 3B. The apartment was small, just a studio with a kitchenette and a bathroom, but it was clean and furnished with simple, sturdy pieces. a bed with a plain blue quilt, a small table with 2 chairs, a couch that had seen better days but still held comfort. James watched as Elena moved through the space with her hands outstretched, her fingers trailing along the walls, learning the dimensions, the layout, the geography of this new world. She found the table, traced its edges, found the couch, pressed her palms against the cushions, found the bed and sat down slowly, testing the mattress. And then she simply collapsed forward, her face in her hands, and began to sob with the kind of abandon that spoke of weeks of holding everything inside. "It's real," she gasped between sobs. "It's really real. A door that locks. A bed. Oh God, a bed." Her whole body shook with the force of her crying, and James stood awkwardly near the door, unsure whether to comfort her or give her space. Finally settling on the latter, understanding that some grief needed to pour out unchecked. When her tears finally subsided, he told her he would be right back, and he drove to the nearest grocery store, filling bags with basics: bread, milk, eggs, fruit, coffee, pasta, and canned soup, things that would sustain her for at least a week. He returned to find her sitting on the couch, her face blotchy but calmer, and he put the groceries away while explaining where everything was located. Before he left, he pressed his business card into her hand, the embossed letters meaningless to her fingers. "My cell number is on there," he said. "Call me if you need anything. Truly anything. I mean that." "You don't even know me," Elena whispered. "Maybe that's exactly why I can help," James replied. Driving home through the Brooklyn streets, James felt something stirring in his chest that he had not felt in a year, perhaps longer. Purpose. Connection. The sense that he had done something that mattered. Inside the apartment, Elena sat with her violin across her lap, her fingers resting on the strings without playing. And for the first time since the darkness had taken her sight, she felt something that resembled hope flickering to life in the emptiness where her future used to be. Over the next 2 weeks, an unlikely friendship took root between them, growing in the quiet spaces of daily kindness and shared understanding. James found himself stopping by the apartment each evening after work, bringing groceries that Elena protested were too much, too generous, until she learned that protesting made no difference and he would bring them anyway. He walked with her through the neighborhood, teaching her the routes to the bodega on the corner, the pharmacy 3 blocks west, the small park where she could sit when the weather allowed. He counted steps with her, described landmarks she could not see but could remember through his words, helped her build a mental map of her new world. Sometimes, when he visited, Elena would play for him, and those evenings became the ones James lived for. She would lift her violin and transform the modest apartment into something transcendent, filling the space with melodies that spoke of joy and sorrow and everything human in between. James would sit on the worn couch and listen with his eyes closed, feeling the music wash over him, fill the hollow places inside him, remind him that beauty still existed even in grief. He arranged for her to receive proper orientation and mobility training through an organization he found online, hiring the instructor himself and paying for 20 sessions before Elena could even think to refuse. He watched as she slowly, painstakingly rebuilt her confidence, learning to navigate with her white cane with increasing skill, learning to cook simple meals by touch and memory, learning to exist in darkness without constant fear. What James noticed most, though, was what Elena would not discuss. Whenever he asked about her life before the blindness, about her training, about where she had learned to play with such extraordinary skill, she would deflect with practiced ease. She would change the subject or grow quiet or suddenly remember something she needed to do. There was a mystery there, a past she was protecting or hiding or perhaps running from. And James recognized the walls she had built because he had built similar ones himself. He respected her privacy, never pushed, understanding that some stories could only be told when the teller was ready. But late at night, alone in his penthouse, he would wonder who Elena really was, and what loss so profound could drive someone of her talent to disappear onto the streets, asking strangers for bread. One evening in mid-December, James arrived at the apartment with someone beside him, and when Elena opened the door, he said, "Elena, this is my daughter, Emma. She's home from college for winter break. I thought maybe you two might like to meet." Emma Chen was 20 years old, with her mother's delicate features and her father's cautious eyes, and she stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, her body language screaming reluctance, as though she had been dragged here against her will and was determined to make that clear. But Elena smiled with such genuine warmth, such unguarded pleasure at meeting her, that something in Emma's defensive posture began to soften. They sat together on the couch, James in the corner chair, and Elena asked Emma about school, about her studies. And when Emma mentioned she was studying music theory, Elena's entire face lit up. "Do you play?" Elena asked, and Emma hesitated, then nodded before remembering and saying, "Piano. I used to. I gave it up in high school." "Why?" Elena's voice was gentle, curious, without judgment. Emma shrugged, a gesture Elena could not see. "I wasn't good enough. Not really. My teacher said I had decent technical skill but no passion, no soul. She said some people are meant to play and others aren't. So, I quit." "That's nonsense," Elena said firmly. "Passion isn't something you're born with or without. It's something you find when you play for the right reasons. When you stop worrying about being good enough and start playing because the music needs to exist in the world and you're the one who can give it life. Would you play something for me now? There's a piano in the community room downstairs." 20 minutes later, they sat in a musty room with a scarred, upright piano that had not been tuned in years, and Emma played a simple Chopin nocturne with hesitant fingers, while Elena listened with her head tilted, absorbing every note. When Emma finished, Elena said, "You have beautiful phrasing. Let me accompany you. Play it again." Elena lifted her violin, and they played together, the piano and violin weaving around each other, and something miraculous happened. Emma's playing opened up, became freer, more confident, as though Elena's presence gave her permission to feel the music instead of just executing it. James stood in the doorway and watched his daughter smile. Truly smile. For the first time in months, perhaps years. After Emma left, promising to return soon, James sat with Elena in the quiet apartment and said, his voice thick, "You gave me my daughter back." Elena reached out and found his hand, squeezed it gently. "Music is the language we speak when words fail us," she said simply. I just helped her remember her own voice. Emma began visiting Elena's apartment 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes to play music together, sometimes just to talk, finding in this blind woman a kindness and understanding she had not found anywhere else. They had become friends, genuine friends, despite the gap in their ages and circumstances. And Emma found herself sharing things she had never told anyone, about her mother's death, about her anger at her father, about feeling lost in a world that seemed to demand she have everything figured out. Elena listened without judgment, without advice unless asked. And somehow, that made all the difference. One Tuesday afternoon in late December, they sat in the apartment together. Elena playing scales and exercises to keep her fingers nimble, while Emma sprawled on the couch scrolling through her phone, half listening to the music. A news article appeared in her feed, something her music theory professor had shared. 6 months later. Where is Elena Morrison? It's... Emma almost scrolled past it, but the accompanying photograph caught her eye. A woman in a stunning emerald gown, standing on a concert stage, violin in hand, spotlights making her glow like something celestial. The woman was younger in the photo, her hair professionally styled, her makeup perfect, but the bone structure of her face, the shape of her mouth, the way she held the violin, all of it was achingly, impossibly familiar. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She looked from her phone to Elena, who stood by the window playing with her eyes closed behind her dark glasses. Completely unaware of Emma's scrutiny, the face was right, the cheekbones, the chin, the graceful neck. Emma felt her hands begin to tremble. She said nothing, finishing the visit with forced normalcy, her mind racing, and the moment she got home, she locked herself in her room and began to research with obsessive intensity. Elena Morrison, The name appeared in hundreds of articles, thousands of search results. World-renowned virtuoso. Youngest soloist ever to perform with the Berlin Philharmonic at age 16. Recordings that went platinum. Concert tickets that sold for $10,000 and sold out in minutes. Performances at Carnegie Hall, the Sydney Opera House, the Royal Albert Hall. Photographs of her at the Met Gala, at state dinners, with presidents and princes and conductors whose names Emma recognized from her textbooks. And then, 6 months ago, she had simply vanished. The articles spoke of a sudden diagnosis, a degenerative condition causing rapid, irreversible blindness. There had been whispers, rumors, speculation, no official statement, no farewell concerts, just absence where there had been brilliance. The classical music world was still searching for her, still wondering, still hoping she would return. Emma stared at her computer screen until her eyes burned, and she understood that the woman teaching her to find her passion, the woman her father had found on a street corner asking for bread, was one of the most celebrated musicians in the world. Emma drove to her father's penthouse that evening, barely able to contain what she had learned. And the moment he opened the door, she pushed past him into the living room, her phone already out, already pulling up articles and photographs. "Dad, you need to see this. You're not going to believe this." James took the phone from her shaking hands and stared at the screen, at the headline, at the photograph of a woman in an emerald gown who looked impossibly glamorous and impossibly familiar. He sank slowly onto the couch, scrolling through article after article, his face growing paler with each new piece of information. Elena Morrison. The name meant nothing to him, but the accomplishments were staggering. Concerts at the world's greatest venues, recordings that sold millions, tickets that commanded $10,000 and still sold out within minutes, collaborations with legends, awards and accolades and recognition at the highest levels of classical music. A woman who had literally had the world at her feet, who had lived a life most people could not even imagine. And now she was asking strangers for bread on a street corner, living in his rent-controlled apartment in Brooklyn, keeping her identity secret for reasons he could not begin to understand. "Why didn't she say anything?" James asked, his voice hollow with shock. Why would she hide this? She could have any help she wanted, any resources. She could reach out to her people, her management, anyone. Emma paced the living room, her energy frantic. "We should confront her. Ask her what's going on. She needs to know we know. What if she needs medical care she's not getting? What if she's in some kind of danger, running from something?" But James held up a hand, his mind working through the implications more slowly, more carefully. "Wait. Think about this. She's clearly chosen to disappear, to become just Elena instead of Elena Morrison. Maybe she has reasons, good reasons. Maybe the weight of that life became too much, especially after losing her sight. Maybe she wanted to know if anyone would care about her as just a person, not as a celebrity." "But Dad," Emma protested, sitting beside him, her voice urgent. "What if she's struggling? What if she's not getting help because she's too proud or too scared? We can't just ignore this. She could be suffering." James rubbed his face, torn between respecting Elena's clear desire for privacy and the growing concern that perhaps she needed intervention, needed someone to break through whatever walls she had built around herself and her past. They invited Elena to dinner at James's penthouse 2 nights later, a carefully planned evening that Emma had orchestrated with nervous energy. James cooked. Something simple he could manage. Pasta with marinara sauce and a salad. While Emma guided Elena through the massive apartment, describing the windows overlooking Central Park, the expensive furniture that even Emma found intimidating. Over dinner, the conversation started casually enough. But Emma's questions grew gradually more pointed, more direct, circling closer to the truth they both knew but Elena had not shared. "Elena," Emma said, her voice gentle but persistent, "you never really talk about your life before. Before you lost your sight. What did you do?" Elena's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and James saw her entire body tense, her shoulders drawing up defensively. "I worked," she said vaguely. "Different things. It doesn't matter now. But where did you learn to play like that?" Emma pressed, and James wanted to signal her to stop, to slow down, but he also wanted to know, needed to understand. Did you ever perform professionally? Elena set down her fork carefully, her hands trembling visibly now, her breath coming faster. I don't want to talk about before, she whispered, and her voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. That person is gone. I lost more than my sight when I got sick. I lost myself, my identity, everything I thought I was. Her voice cracked on the last words, and she pushed back from the table abruptly, standing too quickly, disoriented in the unfamiliar space. She took 2 steps and stumbled, her white cane clattering to the floor, and James was there instantly, his hands on her shoulders, steadying her. The touch broke something inside her, and she collapsed against him, sobbing with the kind of raw, desperate grief that had been building for months. I was someone once, she gasped between sobs, her words muffled against his chest. Someone important, someone people wanted to know. But when I lost my sight, everyone disappeared. My manager told me I was finished, that no one wanted to see a blind violinist, that I should retire gracefully while people still remembered me as I was. My friends, my colleagues, they all pulled away like blindness was contagious. They looked at me with pity, and I couldn't stand it. So, I left. I walked away from all of it because I wanted to see if I was anything without the stage, without the spotlight, without the applause. I wanted to know if the music mattered when no one knew my name. She pulled back slightly, her face streaked with tears, and I found out I was nothing, just another person no one saw. The truth poured out of Elena like water from a broken dam, unstoppable now that the first crack had appeared. She sank back into her chair, James and Emma sitting close, and she told them everything. She had been a prodigy from the age of 4, her entire life shaped around the violin, around being exceptional, around the identity of Elena Morrison, the virtuoso. She had sacrificed everything normal people had, friendships and relationships and lazy afternoons doing nothing, because the music demanded everything, and she had given it willingly. Her entire sense of self was wrapped in being the best, in being extraordinary, in walking onto stages and making thousands of people hold their breath. When the diagnosis came, when the doctors told her the blindness would be rapid and irreversible, her manager had come to her hospital room with a plan. Farewell concerts, he said, a retirement tour. People would pay even more to see her one last time, to witness the tragedy, to say they were there when the great Elena Morrison played her final notes. The thought had horrified her, disgusted her. She did not want pity applause, did not want to be a spectacle of loss. She wanted to know if the music itself mattered, if it had value when stripped of her name and fame. She wanted to know if she mattered as a human being, not just as a performer. So, she had vanished, gave away her wealth to various charities, donated her Stradivarius to a music school, became just Elena, nobody, testing whether music could still matter on a street corner where no one knew her name. But she had found that street corners were lonelier than spotlights, that anonymity was its own kind of prison. She realized too late that she had not been brave or noble. She had been running away from grief rather than facing it, hiding from loss rather than learning to live with it. I understand, James said quietly, and his voice carried the weight of absolute truth. I've been doing the same thing. Running from Sarah's death by burying myself in work, avoiding my daughter because facing her means facing everything I did wrong. We're both running from loss, Elena. Both trying to escape grief by becoming different people. Elena turned her face toward him, tears still sliding down her cheeks. I don't know how to be both, she whispered. How to be Elena Morrison and just Elena. How to hold both lives together. James reached out and took her hand. Maybe you don't have to choose. Maybe you can be both. The music matters because of who you are, not despite it. Your name and your gift are not separate things. Emma sat forward suddenly, her eyes bright with an idea that seemed to electrify her entire body. Wait. My college is hosting a winter charity concert in 2 weeks. It's for the music department scholarship fund. What if you performed? Not as Elena Morrison, not with publicity or press releases or any of that. Just as Elena, a musician who plays because she loves it. just music. Elena's face went pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table. No, I can't. I haven't performed on a real stage since I can't do that. What if I fail? What if I freeze up there? What if... Her breathing was coming faster, panic rising in her throat. James moved closer, his voice calm and steady. No one's asking you to be who you were, Elena. No one's asking you to be the legendary Elena Morrison. We're just asking you to share your gift again, on your own terms. Small steps, with people who care about you. Emma reached across the table and took Elena's trembling hands. You don't have to do it alone. What if we perform together? A duet, piano and violin. We'd be in it together, and if anything goes wrong, we'll handle it together. Please. Elena, let me do this with you. Elena sat frozen, her mind clearly racing through 1,000 fears and possibilities. The silence stretched so long that Emma thought she would refuse, but then Elena's voice emerged, small and frightened, but determined. Only if you promise we're equals up there. Not you accompanying me, but us playing together. A real duet. Emma's face broke into a radiant smile. Yes. Absolutely yes. We'll choose something beautiful, something we both love. We'll practice until we know it in our sleep. This is going to be amazing. Over the next 2 weeks, Emma came to the Brooklyn apartment every afternoon, and they practiced until Elena's fingers ached and Emma's back hurt from hunching over sheet music. Describing notations Elena could not see, they chose Fauré's sonata for violin and piano, a piece full of longing and hope, technically demanding but emotionally accessible. James would arrive in the evenings to find them deep in rehearsal, arguing gently about tempo and phrasing, laughing when they made mistakes, and slowly, gradually, he watched Elena transform. She was still frightened, still uncertain, but something was awakening in her, something that had been dormant for 6 months. She was becoming a musician again. The night of the concert arrived with the weight of inevitability, and Elena stood backstage in the small auditorium, her hands trembling so violently that she could barely hold her violin. She had not stood on a real stage since her diagnosis, had not felt the particular quality of silence that exists in a theater before a performance. And now the terror of it threatened to overwhelm her completely. What if she failed? What if her fingers forgot the notes she had practiced 1,000 times? What if she froze in front of all those people, exposing herself as broken, finished, exactly what her manager had said she was? Emma found her in the wings, took both her hands and squeezed them firmly. We're in this together, Emma said, her voice steady and sure. You and me. If you stumble, I'll catch you. If I mess up, you'll carry me. That's what we do. We're a team. In the audience, James sat in the front row, his heart pounding with a nervousness that had nothing to do with himself and everything to do with the woman he had come to care about deeply. The auditorium was small, intimate, perhaps 200 seats, and it was half full with college students, their families, a few faculty members, people who had come for an evening of student performances and charity fundraising. The house lights dimmed, though Elena could not see them, could only feel the shift in energy. The way conversations quieted and attention focused forward. Emma took her arm, and together they walked onto the stage, their footsteps echoing in the sudden hush. Elena's white cane tapped softly against the floor as she navigated the unfamiliar space, and she heard the small intake of breath from somewhere in the audience, heard the whisper that started low but grew. "Is that a white cane?" someone murmured. "Wait, look at her face," another voice said, louder. "Oh my God! Is that Elena Morrison?" The whisper spread like wildfire through the small auditorium, shocked murmurs building, phones being pulled out, people leaning forward in their seats to get a better look. James heard the recognition spreading and felt his stomach clench with protective anxiety. He wanted to stand up and tell them all to be quiet, to give her space, but he forced himself to remain still. Elena stood at center stage, her violin in one hand, her white cane in the other, and she could hear the whispers building around her, could feel the weight of sudden recognition pressing down like a physical thing. She had wanted anonymity, had run from her name, and now it had found her anyway. Emma squeezed her hand once, hard. A reminder that she was not alone, and Elena took a deep, shaking breath. Emma settled herself at the piano, her fingers finding the opening chords, gentle and searching. An invitation. Elena lifted her violin to her shoulder, the familiar weight both comforting and terrifying, and her hands shook so badly that she almost lowered the instrument, almost walked off the stage, almost surrendered to the fear that screamed she could not do this, that she was broken, that she would fail in front of everyone. But then, something shifted inside her. She remembered why she was here. Remembered the street corner where she had asked for bread. Remembered James's kindness. Remembered Emma's faith. She remembered that music was not something she did, but something she was, woven into the very fabric of her being, and that losing her sight had not changed that fundamental truth. She was a musician, sight or no sight, fame or no fame. She was music, and music was her. She began to play. The room fell into absolute, breathless silence. Every note that emerged from her violin was technically perfect, the product of 30 years of dedication and discipline. But it was so much more than technical perfection. Every note was full of pain and hope and loss and rebirth. Every phrase told the story of falling and rising, of breaking and healing, of dying and being resurrected. She played with her entire soul laid bare, holding nothing back. And tears began streaming down her face, sliding from beneath her dark glasses, falling onto her violin, onto her hands, but she did not stop. Emma played beside her, matching her intensity, their instruments weaving together in a conversation that transcended words. And in the front row, James Chen felt tears streaming down his own face, felt his chest cracking open with the beauty and courage of what he was witnessing. This was not a performance. This was a resurrection. This was a woman reclaiming herself, declaring that she still existed, that she still mattered, that her gift had not died when her sight had failed. The final note hung in the air, trembling, fading, and then silence. The silence held for one heartbeat, 2, 3. Then the small auditorium erupted. People leapt to their feet, applause crashing over the stage like waves, and through it all, Elena stood with her violin lowered, tears still falling, her face transformed by something that looked like peace, like homecoming, like finally finding her way back to herself. People were standing, crying, cheering, their applause echoing off the walls of the small auditorium with an intensity that seemed impossible for such a modest crowd. Elena stood frozen at center stage, overwhelmed by the wall of sound, by the energy pouring toward her, and she felt Emma's arms wrap around her in a fierce hug, felt her friend trembling with joy and pride. Through the applause, Elena could hear other sounds now, the rapid clicking of camera shutters, the electronic beeps of phones recording, capturing this moment. Word was spreading in real time across social media. She would learn later, messages flying through the classical music world with impossible speed. Elena Morrison is performing at a college charity concert. Elena Morrison is back. Elena Morrison is blind but still extraordinary. But this time, she did not run. She stood there, Emma's hand in hers, and she bowed, a simple, graceful acknowledgement of the audience's response. When they finally made their way backstage, James was there, his face wet with tears, and he pulled her into an embrace without words, because words would have been inadequate for what they had all just experienced. Within minutes, Elena's phone, which she had left with James, began ringing incessantly. Her former manager, music journalists, representatives from record labels, concert promoters from around the world. Everyone wanted interviews, wanted comeback tours, wanted exclusive recording contracts, wanted to capitalize on the miraculous return of Elena Morrison. James answered a few calls, taking messages, his voice growing firmer with each one. And when he finally handed the phone to Elena, she held it for a moment, feeling its weight, feeling the pull of that old life trying to reclaim her. But something had changed inside her during those minutes on stage. She had found what she was searching for. The answer to the question that had driven her to the streets 6 months ago. Music mattered because it connected human souls. She mattered not because of her fame, but because of what she could give through her gift. "Thank you all for your interest," she said into the phone, her voice calm and clear. "But I'll perform when and where I choose, on my own terms. Maybe small venues, charity events, teaching young musicians who need someone to believe in them. A new kind of music career, one that feeds my soul instead of consuming it." She ended the calls, turned off the phone, and smiled. She did not need spotlights to shine. She had learned that the hard way, and it was the most valuable lesson of her life. 3 months later, Elena Morrison stood in a small studio she had rented in Brooklyn, surrounded by 6 children between the ages of 8 and 12, each holding instruments that had been donated or purchased through a fundraiser Emma had organized. These were children from underprivileged families, kids who would never have access to private music lessons. And Elena taught them with a patience and joy she had never experienced during her own rigorous training. She performed occasionally now, always at charity events, always in intimate venues that held no more than a few hundred people, and she was happy in a way she had never been when playing for thousands. James and Emma visited every week for dinner, the 3 of them taking turns cooking, and their conversations ranged from trivial to profound, filled with laughter and comfortable silences and the easy affection of people who had chosen to become family. Emma was playing piano again, seriously this time, and she was considering switching her major to music education, wanting to teach the way Elena taught, with love instead of pressure. James had stepped back from the daily operations of his company, appointing a new CEO, and he spent his time volunteering at a homeless shelter, understanding now that purpose came not from building empires, but from seeing people, truly seeing them, the way someone had once seen Elena when she needed it most. On Saturday mornings, Elena sometimes returned to that corner of 57th and 7th, not to beg but to play for free. Her violin case closed at her feet, offering music to anyone who would listen, reminding herself that this was where she had learned the most important lesson of her life. That music was not about the price of the ticket, but about the opening of hearts, and that she had been searching for herself in all the wrong places until she lost everything and discovered that what remained was enough, was more than enough, was everything that truly mattered. Elena Morrison could have stayed lost, could have let bitterness consume her gift, could have believed her manager when he said a blind violinist was finished. But sometimes, what looks like an ending is really a beginning in disguise. Sometimes the greatest performances happen not on the world's most prestigious stages, but on street corners and in small studios and in moments when we choose connection over fame, authenticity over applause. Sometimes a simple act of compassion, a stranger offering a meal, a hand reaching out in darkness, can change everything, can save a life, can remind us that our worth is not measured by what we have lost, but by what we choose to do with what remains. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember that falling is not failing, that losing your way can sometimes be the only path to finding yourself, and that the music we make with our lives matters most when we play it for love instead of recognition.